Be honest. Have you ever been in the middle of doing your homework, staring at a page of text and thought, who decided that the letter A makes the sound A? No, you haven't. And that's exactly the point. We use things every single day, letters, money, glass, the color purple, until they become completely invisible to us. They just feel like a natural part of the world, like the very air you breathe. But none of these things happened by accident. They were invented, and they were popularized by a group of people who designed the modern world from the shadows. Today, we are going to look at the most influential civilization you've probably never studied. They didn't build the Colosseum. They didn't invent democracy. They didn't leave behind massive stone temples to terrify their neighbors. But without them, Rome would have remained a small, forgotten, muddy village. Greece would have been mostly illiterate. And you? You would still be drawing little pictures of cows and sheep on a clay tablet just to text your friend, "Hey, I bought 3 sheep today." These people didn't build massive stone pyramids for dead kings. They didn't build giant border walls to keep the rest of the world out. Instead, they built ships to go everywhere. They were the Phoenicians. And by the time we finish today, you're going to realize that you are actually thinking in Phoenician right now. Literally. Let me show you what I mean. If you open up a standard history textbook, it usually describes the Phoenicians in a single, passing sentence as a trading culture. But saying the Phoenicians were just a trading culture is like saying Michael Jordan was pretty good at throwing an orange ball. It is technically true, but it misses absolutely everything that actually matters. It misses the genius of their strategy. The Phoenicians realized a fundamental truth about power that their neighbors completely missed. You don't need to conquer land to control the world. You just need to control the networks that connect the land. Think about the map of the ancient world. You had the Egyptians to the south, obsessed with building giant monuments for the afterlife. You had the Babylonians and Assyrians to the east, constantly building massive walls and raising massive armies because they were terrified of being invaded. All of these empires looked at the Mediterranean Sea, this massive, violent body of water, and they saw a monster. They saw an unpredictable, terrifying barrier that would swallow your men alive. The Phoenicians looked at that exact same ocean and said, "That's not a monster, that's a highway." Think about that shift in mindset. It's what modern business leaders call a blue ocean strategy. When everyone else is fighting over the same scrap of dirt, you turn around and walk into the space nobody else is willing to touch. The ancient world was filled with hesitation. People were terrified of the sea, terrified of running out of food before winter, and deeply terrified of strangers. The Phoenicians looked at that global hesitation and asked a completely different question. What if we go when nobody else will? Imagine a Phoenician father standing on a wooden dock 3,000 years ago, looking out at a dark sky, telling his son, "Get in the boat. The storm means the Egyptian and Greek traders are staying home today. And because they are staying home, our cargo is going to be worth 3 times as much when we land." That wasn't reckless luck. That was pure calculated math. They understood that risk and reward are directly connected. By mastering the sea, they bypassed the bloody, expensive land wars of the Bronze Age and quietly built a commercial empire that stretched from the coast of modern-day Lebanon all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Firstly, let's look at the tools they left behind. I call it their PTO framework, patent, trade, and ownership. It was a 3-part system designed for maximum efficiency, and the very first pillar of that system is something you use every single second of your day: the alphabet. Before the Phoenicians arrived on the scene, writing was not meant for everyday people. It was a heavily gate-kept, incredibly complex weapon of control used by the ruling elite. Think about the Egyptians. They had hieroglyphs. If you wanted to write a simple message in ancient Egypt, you had to memorize over 700 different highly detailed pictures. To the east, in Mesopotamia, the cuneiform system used by the Babylonians required you to learn roughly 1,000 different wedge-shaped symbols stamped into wet clay. Because it was so incredibly difficult, learning to read and write took a lifetime of intense study. It created a permanent class divide. You had a tiny group of state-sponsored priests and royal scribes who held all the keys to information, laws and history, while 99% of the population remained completely illiterate, entirely dependent on what the ruling class told them. The Phoenicians looked at that entire system, pulled out their ledgers, and said, "That is absolutely terrible for business." Think about it from the perspective of an ancient salesperson. You are standing on a noisy, crowded dock in the middle of a hot afternoon. You have 40 crates of cedar wood from Lebanon, 12 jugs of olive oil, and a Greek merchant who wants to buy them right now before his ship sails. You do not have 30 minutes to carefully sketch a beautiful, detailed picture of an ibis bird, or an eye, just to write down that he owes you 12 silver pieces. You need speed. You need simplicity. You need a system so streamlined that a busy dock worker or a tired fisherman can learn it in a week, not a decade. So, the Phoenicians did something revolutionary. They stopped trying to write down ideas or objects using pictures. Instead, they looked at human speech and realized that every word we say is just a combination of the same basic vocal sounds. They isolated those sounds and boiled them down into just 22 simple geometric letters. It was the ancient equivalent of open-source software. Suddenly, writing wasn't a sacred, mysterious ritual for priests hidden away in stone temples. It was a practical tool for everyday merchants on the street. If you could speak the language, you could spell it. If you could spell it, you could trade it. When the Phoenicians sailed across the Mediterranean to trade with the Greeks, they didn't just drop off logs of cedar wood and purple cloth. They dropped off their 22 letters. The Greeks looked at this hyper-efficient system, realized how much better it was than their own old writing systems, and immediately adopted it. A few centuries later, the Romans took that same system from the Greeks, adjusted a few shapes, added a couple of letters, and spread it across their entire empire. That is why you are reading the words on this screen right now in letters instead of looking at a long string of digital emojis. The very bones of the modern internet, from the code, running in the background to the text message you sent 5 minutes ago, rest entirely on a 22-letter shorthand invented by ancient Phoenician accountants who just wanted a faster way to track their inventory. But they didn't stop at redefining language. They also redefined how we see the world, quite literally, with their second major breakthrough, transparent glass. For thousands of years, people had known how to make rough, colored glass objects, but it was thick, cloudy, and mostly used for cheap beads or heavy ornaments. The Phoenicians completely transformed the industry by working on the coastal beaches of modern-day Lebanon and Israel. They discovered that if you heated the local silica sand to an incredibly high, precise temperature, you could strip away the impurities. Legend has it they figured this out entirely by accident. A group of Phoenician sailors supposedly landed on a sandy beach, couldn't find any stones to prop up their cooking pots over the fire, and decided to use blocks of natron, a type of salt mineral, from their cargo instead. As the heat intensified, the salt melted and fused with the beach sand, creating a clear, shimmering liquid that hardened as it cooled. Whether it happened by accident or through years of deliberate trial and error, the result was a massive technological leap. The Phoenicians mastered the art of glass blowing. Suddenly, you could create perfectly clear glass vessels that allowed you to actually see what was inside them. It laid the very early foundations for windows, mirrors, and lenses that would completely change human architecture and science centuries later. Once again, they took raw, everyday elements, sand and fire, and turned them into a highly valuable, mass-produced commodity that every kingdom in the Mediterranean was desperate to buy. This brings us to the third and final pillar of the Phoenician PTO framework, ownership. And nothing demonstrated ownership in the ancient world quite like their most lucrative, closely guarded secret, Tyrian Purple. Have you ever stopped to wonder why the color purple has been associated with royalty, kings and emperors for thousands of years? Why not bright red or a deep forest green? The answer has nothing to do with aesthetics and everything to do with a tiny, slimy sea snail called the Balinus brandaris, or the murex snail. Before the Phoenicians weaponized this creature, clothes in the ancient world were dull. Most people wore rough, undyed wool or linen that quickly turned an earthy shade of brown or grey from sweat and dirt. Even when people did manage to dye clothes using plants, the colours were faded, washed out, and would completely disappear after a few cycles under the hot sun. The Phoenicians discovered that the murex snail carried a tiny gland that produced a single drop of thick, milky fluid when irritated. If you extracted that fluid, boiled it in massive lead vats for days, and exposed it to precise amounts of sunlight, a chemical reaction occurred. The dull liquid transformed into a rich, deep, mesmerizing purple dye. But here is the catch that made this color an economic superpower. The process was staggeringly inefficient. To harvest enough dye to color just one single t-shirt or a simple royal robe, you had to dive to the bottom of the sea, crack open, and process roughly 10 to 12,000 individual snails. Because of this, Phoenician coastal cities like Tyre and Sidon became massive industrialized factory towns. And to be completely honest with you, they smelled absolutely horrendous. Ancient writers recorded that the stench of rotting snail carcasses around Phoenician ports was so incredibly foul and overpowering that it made the cities almost unlivable for outsiders. But the Phoenicians didn't care about the smell. They cared about the math, because it took thousands of snails and weeks of brutal, intense labor to create a tiny vial of dye. Tyrian Purple became the most valuable substance on the planet. Ounce for ounce, it was literally worth more than its weight in pure gold. A single pound of purple-dyed wool could easily cost more than an average Roman citizen or Greek farmer could earn in a lifetime of hard work. This meant that if you saw a king, a general, or a wealthy senator walking down the street wearing a purple robe, you weren't just looking at a fashion choice. You were looking at an undeniable message of absolute ownership and infinite resources. It was the ancient equivalent of driving a multi-million-dollar supercar down the street today. By monopolizing this color, the Phoenicians made themselves indispensable to every royal court on earth. If a foreign pharaoh or emperor wanted to prove to his subjects that he was a living god with ultimate power, he had no choice but to pay the Phoenicians whatever outrageous price they demanded for their purple cloth. But let's step away from the luxury for a moment and talk about the part of this trading empire that history books often like to gloss over. Because if we are going to look at the true mechanics of how they ran the world, we have to look at the full, unfiltered picture. The Phoenicians were merchants, and merchants, at their most hyper-efficient, look at the entire world through a very cold lens of supply and demand. To a Phoenician executive, anything that could be moved across an ocean and sold for a profit was considered inventory, and that included human beings. When Phoenician ships sailed out past the edge of the known world, discovering massive silver mines in Spain or rich tin deposits in Britain, they didn't just trade goods with the local tribes. They also participated heavily in the global slave trade. I'm not telling you this to shock you or to make them look like cartoon villains. I'm telling you this because history is not a neat, clean fairy tale. The Phoenicians didn't engage in human trafficking out of pure cruelty. They did it out of a completely detached, mathematical view of resources. If a Greek city-state needed labor to clear a forest, or an Egyptian noble wanted servants for his villa, the Phoenicians saw a market demand. And where there was demand, they supplied the inventory. A human life was written down on the exact same clay ledger, using the exact same 22 letters, right next to a log of timber or a jug of olive oil. It is deeply uncomfortable to think about, and it absolutely should be. But this brings us to a fascinating personal observation about how we look at history today. Have you ever noticed that our modern culture loves to celebrate explorers like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, or Ferdinand Magellan as incredibly brave, heroic adventurers who defied the odds? Yet, we almost never use the word brave to describe the Phoenicians. Why is that? It's because the Phoenicians didn't write grand, dramatic poetry about the beauty of the sea. They didn't compose heroic myths about fighting sea monsters or conquering dangerous lands for the glory of an empire. They wrote receipts, thousands and thousands of mundane clay invoices. When modern archaeologists dig up ancient Phoenician trash heaps, which scientists call middens, they don't find epic stories of lost kings. They find broken wine jugs, fish bones, and ancient receipts tracking who bought how many blankets, how much grain, and how many pieces of silver changed hands on a Tuesday afternoon. The Romans wrote grand histories to justify their wars. The Greeks wrote timeless plays to explore the human psyche. The Phoenicians wrote receipts to balance their books. And because they were so completely practical, history almost forgot them entirely. But you don't survive as a dominant global culture for over 1,000 years by being a poet. You survive by being entirely realistic about how the world actually works. But this hyper-practical, receipt-driven worldview didn't just change their balance sheets. It fundamentally altered how human beings interact with one another across vast, impossible distances. It solved a problem that you face every single time you tap your phone to pay for something online. How do I safely trade with a complete stranger? Think about the sheer scale of the Phoenician network. Their sailors were landing on beaches in West Africa, the rugged coastlines of Spain, and the fog-heavy shores of Britain. They didn't share a drop of DNA with the local tribes. They didn't share a religion. They didn't share a culture. And they certainly didn't speak the same language. In the ancient world, arriving unannounced on a foreign beach with a boat full of cargo usually ended in a bloodbath. If you didn't look like the locals, you were an invader. If you couldn't speak to them, you were an enemy. The Phoenicians looked at that deep-seated human xenophobia and bypassed it entirely using raw, unemotional systems. They invented two tools that completely eliminated the need for cultural alignment or personal trust. The first was something historians call silent trade. A Phoenician ship would pull up to a foreign shore, offload a specific amount of cargo, say 10 bolts of purple cloth and 5 clear glass jars, and lay them out neatly on the sand. Then they would climb back into their boats, row out into the surf, and light a smoky fire on their deck to signal that the store was open. The local tribesmen would walk down to the beach, inspect the goods, and place what they thought was a fair amount of raw silver or tin next to the cargo. Then they would walk back into the tree line. The Phoenicians would row back ashore. If the pile of silver matched their internal math, they took the metal, left the cargo, and rowed away. If the silver wasn't enough, they didn't get angry. They didn't pull out swords. They simply rowed back to their ships and waited. The locals would return, add more metal, and the process repeated until the ledger was balanced. No words were spoken. No promises were made. The entire transaction was governed by a mutual respect for numbers. But as their empire scaled, carrying massive, heavy blocks of raw silver and bartering with individual logs of cedar became a logistical nightmare. It slowed down the transaction speeds on the docks. So, the Phoenicians weaponized the second tool in their PTO framework. They became the ultimate global distributors of standardized coinage. Before them, money wasn't a standard thing. You had to physically weigh every single scrap of silver or gold on a scale during a transaction, arguing over the purity of the metal and the accuracy of the weights. The Phoenicians realized that if they stamped a piece of metal with an official, universally recognized corporate mark, guaranteeing its exact weight and purity, they could skip the weighing process entirely. Suddenly, you didn't have to carry 3 heavy cows or a wagon full of grain across a desert just to buy tools. You carried a small, lightweight leather pouch filled with stamped silver discs. You use this exact Phoenician abstraction every single time you buy a coffee or scan a credit card. You are participating in a system where value is disconnected from physical objects and placed into a universally accepted, trusted symbol. They standardized trust so they could maximize velocity, and for a long time, it made them completely bulletproof. But you cannot run a global corporate network forever without eventually attracting the attention of a military monopoly. So, you might be asking, if these people designed the underlying infrastructure of our daily lives, where did they go? Why don't we see their ruins on every postcard? To answer that, we have to look at their ultimate corporate spin-off. Around 814 BC, a Phoenician princess named Dido fled the coastal city of Tyre after a bloody political coup. She sailed west across the Mediterranean and landed on a strategically flawless peninsula in North Africa, in modern-day Tunisia. She founded a city called Carthage. In the Phoenician language, Carthage literally translated to Carthage, which simply means new city. It was originally designed to be nothing more than a midway refueling station and trading outpost for Phoenician ships heading out toward the silver mines of Spain. But Carthage had a geographical advantage that the old homeland back in Lebanon never possessed. It sat right in the narrow bottleneck of the Mediterranean, completely commanding the trade routes between the east and the west. Within a few centuries, the student overtook the master. As the old Phoenician home cities were slowly swallowed up by the land-based empires of Persia and Assyria, Carthage inherited the entire global maritime network. Carthage became a commercial leviathan. They built an artificial, circular military harbour called the Kothon that could house over 200 warships in hidden, standardized docking slips. They didn't care about territorial expansion. They cared about market dominance. They didn't want to rule your people. They just wanted to tax your ships. For 600 years, the Phoenician daughter city controlled the absolute wealth of the Western world. And then, they ran directly into an aggressive, hyper-nationalistic startup on the Italian peninsula. A city built on iron, discipline, and an insatiable hunger for land, Rome. When Carthage and Rome collided in the 3rd century BC, it wasn't just a war between two cities. It was a violent, systemic clash between two completely opposing worldviews. Carthage was a commercial superpower run by merchant accountants. They looked at war the exact same way they looked at a shipment of purple dye, through the cold lens of a cost-benefit analysis. Because of this, Carthage didn't waste its own citizens' lives on the battlefield. They simply used their immense financial reserves to hire professional mercenaries from all over the world, Numidian cavalry, Spanish swordsmen, and Celtic infantry. To Carthage, a war was just an expensive project, and soldiers were just independent contractors. Rome was the exact opposite. Rome was an agrarian, hyper-militarized society optimized entirely for total war and territorial conquest. When Rome went to war, they didn't care about the financial cost. They didn't calculate the return on investment. They mobilized their own citizens, fought with a fanatic, relentless discipline, and were entirely willing to lose hundreds of thousands of their own men if it meant total victory. For over a century, these two titan systems tore the Mediterranean apart in a series of conflicts known as the Punic Wars. And in 146 BC, during the Third Punic War, the mathematical efficiency of Carthage finally ran directly into the unrelenting iron wall of Rome. The Roman legions breached the walls of Carthage. What followed wasn't just a military defeat. It was a cold, systematic liquidation of an entire civilization. The Romans spent 17 days systematically burning Carthage to the ground, block by block. Out of a population of roughly 500,000 people, only 50,000 survived the siege, and they were promptly rounded up and sold directly into the Roman slave markets. The great libraries of Carthage, containing centuries of maritime records, historical texts, and Phoenician literature, were entirely destroyed or distributed to local African chieftains who had sided with Rome. The Roman Senate ordered that the physical city be completely leveled. They even spread salt over the blackened fields, a brutal, symbolic gesture meant to declare to the universe, nothing will ever grow here again. This city will never rise again. And this brings us to the ultimate twist that most generic history videos completely leave out. Because Rome completely liquidated Carthage, they didn't just win the war, they won the exclusive right to tell the story. We have almost no surviving Phoenician history books. We have no Carthaginian poetry. We have absolutely no records written by the people who actually built the maritime highway of the ancient world. Almost every single thing we know about the Phoenicians and Carthaginians today was written by their bitterest opponents, the Romans and the Greeks. Imagine that 2,000 years from now, every single trace of your existence, your texts, your achievements, your personality was completely erased from the earth, and the only thing that survived about you was a review written by someone who deeply disliked you and wanted to justify ruining your life. That is the Phoenician problem. We only see them through a distorted, hostile lens. The Romans painted the Carthaginians as treacherous, cruel, and untrustworthy. They created the term Punic faith as an ancient insult, meaning total deceitfulness. The Phoenicians made a fatal mistake. They believed that money was louder than words. They thought that as long as they controlled the receipts, the numbers, and the networks, they didn't need to waste time writing grand epic poetry or legendary myths to defend their legacy. They were wrong. Words outlast empires. But even though Rome tried to salt their fields and burn their memory into ash, the Phoenician system was too efficient to die. Rome couldn't operate their new global empire without using the very tools the Phoenicians left behind. So here is the moment I promised you at the very beginning of our class. The one that proves you are living inside their architecture right now. Look at your phone. Look at your keyboard. Those 26 letters you use to text your friends or type out an essay. 22 of those characters come directly from the Phoenician alphabet. The Greeks borrowed them. The Romans modified them. But the structural bones belong entirely to those ancient salespeople. Look at the last thing you bought online or the cash inside your wallet. That price tag exists because the Phoenicians popularized the concept of standardized, trusted coinage, saving you from having to argue about how many cows a sandwich is worth on a Tuesday afternoon. You aren't just watching a passive history lesson. You are reading Phoenician. You are spending Phoenician. You are operating daily inside a 3,000-year-old operating system designed by a practical group of merchants who looked at a terrifying ocean and decided to build a highway. And now that you can see the invisible architecture of the world, you can never unsee it. If you want to keep reading the receipts that empires try to burn, and if you want to understand the rules that actually run our world, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now. Because in our next class, we are going to look at another structure of history that completely changed human behavior from the shadows. Class dismissed. Go look at your phone keyboard, seriously, do it now. Those letters are 3,000 years old, and they still work. See you in the records.